Hi and welcome to this review for Pavane by Keith Roberts. This is a book I've heard about a bit. I've read a few reviews, I've heard a few reviews. I was keen for it and I thought I knew a little bit about what was happening here or what was going to be happening. And I was right, I did. But it was still intensely surprising in that for all I thought I knew about it and all I'd read about it, I had no expectation for how incredibly good it was. The writing in this is spectacular, and I was blown away. I enjoyed just about every second of this book. Oh yes, and let's start with my rather pretty little Panther edition. So this cover, which is heavily surrealist and which I really, really love. Who painted it? Good question. So the artist is not credited. There's no anywhere in the book. There's no signature on the cover. The internet agrees with me. In fact, I feel it's quite possible this painting was never intended for this book, since absolutely nothing on this spectacularly beautiful and intriguing cover has anything to do with anything that happens inside the book. But still, lovely. It has been credited to Bob Haberfield according to ISFDB, but it's been attributed to him by his son on an Instagram post. I'm not sure how valid that is, but whatever. Anyhow, so Pavane, novel. Since it doesn't seem to be terribly well known, I'll make some points about it. It's an alternative history science fiction book. Technically a fix-up. So a fix-up can be basically at times a whole heap of short stories with no actual connection, and that's what I thought this was for the first 3 parts. But it later comes together in such a way that I do think that it rates as a novel. Certainly the later parts wouldn't have the impact, and you wouldn't be able to follow them the same way if you hadn't read the earlier parts. So yes, I think novel is fair. It ends with a short coda, and I feel that the coda was probably written later to tie it all together. As short stories, however, they were written in the 60s, and I think maybe even the 70s, but definitely some of them in the 60s, during an era where there was a huge fascination in speculative fiction about alternative histories. And this particular cycle of linked stories or alternative histories are set in Dorset, England. I didn't know that. My English history really isn't that good, and my English geography isn't that great either. This is an intensely English book, and I think if you are from England, you'll probably get more from it than I did. But I got enough from it. I absolutely loved this book. When I was reading it, I enjoyed every second. When I wasn't reading it, I was looking forward to reading it. I was thinking about the things I'd previously read. And when I say looking forward to reading it, I don't mean that it was one of those books that you read it because you want to know how things turns out. There's a couple of really exciting stories in there, and you do want to know how things turn out. But the actual reading experience was what I loved more than anything else about this. The writing is beyond beautiful, but if you aren't into literature, the stories are good enough that you can just read it as the story as well. So this novel posits a 1966, which is, I guess, when it was first being put together, in which Queen Elizabeth I was assassinated just as the Spanish Armada was heading for England. On a warm July evening of the year 1588, did I say 66? 1588. In the royal palace of Greenwich, London, a woman lay dying, an assassin's bullets lodged in abdomen and chest. Her face was lined, her teeth blackened, and death lent her no dignity. But her last breath started echoes that ran out to shake a hemisphere. For the fairy queen, Elizabeth I, paramount ruler of England, was no more. The rage of England knew no bounds, and that is the beauty of the writing. It's subtle, it's delicate, it's lovely, it draws you in. But the alternative history behind it is also quite fascinating and does draw you in. So posited that Queen Elizabeth I was assassinated at just that moment in time, the Spanish Armada lands and conquers England. Now, that was a delicate point in English history. Elizabeth I and Queen Mary were both children of Henry, who broke away from the Catholic Church in Rome so that he could marry whoever he wanted to, or rather divorce whoever he wanted to. He created the Protestant religion, or maybe the Anglican. I don't know that much about the religions, and I sometimes get confused, but Protestants definitely were in it. So when Queen Mary came in, she was devoutly Catholic, and she was a scourge. She went through the Protestants like you wouldn't believe. It was a very hard time for the Protestants. Queen Elizabeth, however, was Protestant, and when she got into power, she was heavily against the Catholicism. They had a horrible time. Many of them were killed in heaps of horrible ways, hence the priests' holes in many houses in England. There was a huge amount of removal of everything. In the absence of Queen Elizabeth, Protestantism kept its hold on England, and even after the Spanish, we're told, were driven out of England, Protestantism had been reduced to a vague memory that no one really recalled. The Church of Rome had complete power over England, exceeding its own monarchs, who were merely, by the sound of it, tools to the Holy Roman Empire. Now, as the overview describes it, that had huge implications for the rest of Europe and hence the world. So the Dutch Republic, which was Protestant, never really had the chance of gaining independence with Spain in charge of England. And I don't entirely understand how that happened, but like I said, my history of the region isn't all that great. In the meantime, the German mercantile city-states, which I believe were either the Hanseatic states or the inheritors of the Hanseatic states, and had a huge amount of trading mercantile power in Europe and the Baltic and that whole region. They were incredibly powerful, and they helped fund part of the Reformation, which was in opposition to Catholicism. And they never got going either in the absence of England as a Protestant nation under Queen Elizabeth. By the same token, England as a rule Britannica never existed, so the Commonwealth never existed. So you never had that huge worldwide power that was England. And in the absence of that, the Catholic Church is the dominant power in the world. Now, America has been settled in this book, The New World, but it was settled in a different way, and that makes sense because a lot of the people who originally settled in America were small religious groups who wanted to keep their own religion, like Quakers, for example. Other ones too, I suppose. And they went there to escape prosecution. But in this alternative universe, those splinter religions would never have had a chance because Catholicism had a stranglehold over everything. In Australia, or Australasia as they call it, Captain Cook did indeed discover Australia and planted a flag, but it wasn't the flag of England, it was the flag of the throne of Peter, the Catholic Church. So poor old Australia. And that happened in the 18th century. So all of this combined to create a completely different topography of the world to what we see in our reality. And in England, the implications included a very feudal system, all totally under the thumb of the church, which means that no technology is allowed to advance without the approval of the church. So they've got the science to create electrical lights and a whole heap of other things, but unless Rome approves them, they're not allowed to. As a consequence, you've got this feudal, pre-industrial nation. Some inventions are allowed, and we'll talk about a couple of those, but for the most part, there isn't any. It's pre-industrialized, very feudal, small centers of civilization, very, very non-independent of the weather and the scenario and of the fairies, which are real in these books. Not overstated, but the old people are there. So, I do not mean to spoiler these stories. These stories are excellent. They deserve to be read for themselves and enjoyed the way I enjoyed them. But in a sense, I have spoiled this book because everything that I've put together to you is never spelt out in that. I put it together in my own head after reading this book or during reading this book. I Googled some history, I Wikipedia'd Pavane, and now I know more about the whole story. So that is kind of a spoiler, but it doesn't spoil the stories. And I think it makes it easier to enjoy Pavane because something that Keith Roberts does here that is amazing is how subtle he is about the alternative world he's writing in. Now, a lot of old history, and as I said, in the 60s and 70s, there's a whole heap of it. A lot of it beats you over the head with how brutal it is. It's like, oh, because this happened, this world is like this. And it's like a person wandering around doesn't know an alternative history. They know this history. A person wandering around Pavane isn't thinking about Elizabeth being assassinated because that's just a thing that happened in their past. The same way that the average person wandering around Australia in the shops isn't thinking about King Henry divorcing the Catholic Church so he could divorce his wife. We just don't think about it day to day. We don't wonder extensively. Well, us SF enthusiasts and speculative fiction enthusiasts think about it, but we don't extensively wonder on a day-to-day basis how it would have been. Besides, Keith Roberts has already told us, kinda. So the people in this book don't think that way, and we, seeing from behind the scenes, get to see their world in their first way. The first story is The Lady Margaret, and it comes from De Novaria, England, 1968. It's an unrecognizable 1968. It is very medieval. De Novaria, I don't know. I'm going to guess that that's Dover, Dorset, something like that. The one thing I can focus on name-wise is London is still Londinium, like it was in Roman times. Actually, Romans first made London Londinium as a town. I don't think it was there before. Anyway, I digress again. This first story, The Lady Margaret, is a marvelous story. It centers around Jessie Strong. I think it's Strange. Surname. Come on, Master Jessie, what's your surname? Anyway, Jessie is a driver of is a haulier. They call it a haulier of a locomotive engine. Now, whether you like science fiction or not, if you know anyone who's seriously into their trains, they need to read this book. The Lady Margaret is all about these steam tractors. I guess they're a kind of steam tractor. So in this alternative universe, what you've got is these basically choo-choo trains, which are their lorries or their road trains. It's a steam engine, but it doesn't go on tracks. They obviously don't have the level of industrialization to put down tracks. They go on wheels on roads, and there's a small mention of how they wreck the roads. Now, reading this, I was fascinated. I had a vague memory that early steam engines weren't on tracks, so I went to look that up. In America, there's the Lombard steam log hauler, but in England there was a steam tractor, and apparently the two technologies developed quite differently. If you like technology, if you like engineering, if you like trains, this first one is amazing. Our protagonist is Jessie, and he's driving his favorite train, the Lady Margaret, which he got to name himself when he was a small boy. And basically it talks about the engine, it talks about how it works. It's all very early choo-choo train. It also mentions in passing types of technology that could improve the train, but which the church in Rome either has forbidden or has failed to approve. There's no way that I can really describe this story and make it as exciting, absorbing, and interesting as it is to read. The reading experience was incandescently beautiful. And I don't even really like trains that much. And describing it, it sounds dull. So Jessie taking off this Lady Margaret locomotive on its routine haulage, because it hauls a whole heap of carts behind it. And it's basically picking up and dropping off carting goods from place to place. It's winter. It describes the freezing, icy cold. It describes how he needs to get the balance of steam and water and stoking right so that it works. And in the meantime, Jessie is deeply troubled inside his head because his father, who established the company, Strong's Motors, I think they are called, has just died. And all the things that he never managed to say to his father are roiling inside his head. At the same time, he's going on this trip and he's crossing these heaths where routiers, I think they're called, which are basically highwaymen, are known to exist. And we have this hint that the Strong Steam Company has got a method which it hasn't yet used, but it plans to use. It doesn't carry guns or muskets or anything against these routiers. It's got a plan. And we later see that plan in action, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, and I'm not going to tell you how it goes down, because it takes the breath out of you when that part of the plot finally comes about. The other thing Jessie wants to do is he wants to meet up with a woman that he'd really like to marry, and he's never and they're not sweethearts or anything. She lives in a different town. He really wants to catch her, and he's a shy, retiring type, and so he's got all these things roiling in his head, and that makes it sound dull. And this is anything but dull. This is an absolutely spectacular story, and it kept me on the edge of the seat. It's not a short one either. So the amount of effort, or at least the amount of research Roberts must have done in order to know this much about trains, to be able to describe them as so gleaming and exciting and fascinating, it's amazing. There is a brief mention also of semaphore towers, signal towers. And I'm not going to say anything more about that story. Lady Margaret, absolutely amazing story. Not like anything else I've ever really read. If you go online, it will tell you it's about a lonely steam haulier. And he's not a lonely steam haulier. He is a very busy in his head young steam haulier. And yes, he does meet a friend from his past, and that's a major part of the story as well. The characterization in this is phenomenal. I don't know what black magic Roberts manages to do, but the characters in his first 3 stories in this collection, the characterization is beyond compare. Jessie is such a real person by the end of the story, and yeah, it's just brilliant. Okay, so the second story is The Signaller, and it's about an apprentice semaphore operator. And I've got a bird, and this bird wants to eat books. He's got a book in his sights, and he's heading straight for it. What are we going to do, bird? Do you want to go flying instead? Okay, so the signaller kicks off with a real gut punch as well, because you start off with this young man who's in a small forested area all alone in the dead of winter, and he's bleeding and gashed, and it sounds like he's dying, to be honest. But Roberts manages to describe the indomitable will of humanity, and how when faced with a situation which they can't survive, they still, every last breath they take to survive. And so we follow this guy, this young man, who's obviously been completely and utterly carved up, and we never find out how initially, as he struggles to get back to the isolated hut where he is acting as a semaphore operator. I'm not sure I'm saying that word right. It's not a word I've ever said before. We then go back in time to when he's a pudgy young boy lying on the heath, fascinated by the signaller towers. And once again, Keith Roberts goes into a huge amount of technical engineering detail about how these towers operate, how the signals operate, and the guild that operates them as well. So, huge amount of information, really fascinatingly described. And here again, we've got Rafe is his name, and we see him as a child being accepted into the guild against all expectation because he doesn't come from a guild family, learning the ropes, and then finally being assigned to this outlying tower where he meets the event that has him carved up into ribbons when we first meet him. And I'm not saying anything more about this one either. But once again, amazing characterization. And here we first encounter fairies and this strange symbol that keeps reoccurring throughout the book, which I will find somewhere here and show you. Okay, so that's the symbol. It keeps on occurring over and over again. It's associated with fairies in some way. Now, Rafe doesn't really pay much attention inside his head to all the things I spoke about in the beginning of this video. He isn't particularly religious. He isn't particularly interested in the church in Rome. He lives in his world, and his world is the semaphore towers and signaling. It's all he's been interested in for his entire life. And it's all about that. In the same way that the steam haulier, it's all about the engines. And while Jesse has got a wider experience of the world and a wider interest in things that are happening, especially in science, which he would like to implement but might not be able to. Again, they each one of them living in their own world. The third story in this book is Brother John. But first, quick word on that. In this collection is Brother John, but there's also an SF Masterworks book out there, and in that one, the third story is The White Boat. Now, I've read The White Boat. It's in a book that's somewhere on the shelf behind me, The Grain Kings. And I wish when I'd read The White Boat, I'd understood that it was in an alternative universe, because altreality, because I didn't. I had no idea what was happening there. If it had been included in this book, I would probably have enjoyed that story a lot more. I didn't much like it. I was scathing about it in my review, but I didn't know what was happening. If it was in here, I would have known what was happening, but in no other way do I regret it. I didn't love that story in general. I will plan to reread it now and see if I like it better now that I know it's a different universe. But I don't think it fits in this book, because this book, each step takes you towards a conclusion, and The White Boat wouldn't have got you there. So my third story is Brother John, and this was a marvelous story. For each of these three stories, you've had tech. So the tech, science and technology in Brother John is all about printing press. Now, my understanding is that Keith Roberts himself was a printer and a very, very able artist. And he does describe the printing process of sanding down stones to be the basis. It all sounds fascinating and intriguing. And beautifully written. Now, in Brother John, you've got yet another protagonist, John, who is a brother, surprisingly enough. He's in a small monastery, which is very much dedicated. It's a crafter monastery. And John himself, while a monk and apparently believing in the party line of religion and being quite devout in his own specific way, he's not, the wellspring of his being isn't religion, it's art, and that's why he's in the monastery. His small crofter family couldn't do anything with him because all he wanted to do was paint all day, so they sent him here. And now he's a printer and he's an artist. And he's created as a character early on and very, very well. He's a little bit ornery. He's an excellent craftsman. He's about 30, I think, in this story. But he's a little bit ornery. He's a little bit at odds with the master of the printing floor. And then he is summoned to the head of his monastery, to his order, and I wish I could remember the name of the order, on a special assignment. So when he gets to the Reverend Father, the abbot tells him that he specifically, because of his amazing artwork and how well he designs things like labels for stuff, he's been asked to go on a special assignment. And the special assignment is for the quarter's spiritual welfare, and he is going to be documenting through art events. Now, Brother John isn't particularly keen on that, but the master of lithography apparently doesn't completely like him, and he realizes that while it's an honor he doesn't particularly want, but he doesn't really have a choice. And the abbot sends him off, and he gathers all his printing gear, his pencils and charcoals and inks and sketch pads, gets on a horse and heads off to some other part of England that I can't pronounce or remember. But his abbot is a little bit worried about that, because the other name for the court of spiritual welfare is the Inquisition. John entered the great castle of Debris by the old gate amid a noisy crowd of sightseers, mendicants, soldiers, townsfolk out for the day with picnic hampers and beer. And he passes by a series of cages in which people are about to be put to the question. It isn't heavy on gore, but this is a harsh story. This is about the Inquisition, and it's about the underlying fanaticism that allowed the Inquisition and is allowing it in this version of 1966 in England, an England that has never broken its bonds to the Catholic Church. And it talks a little bit, perhaps not in too much detail, but in a fair amount of detail for an imaginative person, about all the instruments of torture that are there. And we get the speech from a brother on why you have to torture people to get their confession, or it isn't real. And Roberts manages to quite brilliantly showcase a fanaticism that inside the head of someone is so very valid and real. But we're seeing it through Brother John's head, and he's no fanatic, and he's got doubts. Brother John spends some months in this location, visually documenting all the things that occurred. And we see him as he leaves this castle. He's a broken human. He can barely function enough to sit a horse, and only because people take care of him along the way does he make it back to the monastery. I think it's a monastery that he came from. It is harrowing watching the broken hulk that John has become, not through being tortured, but through observing this torture every day, and through his own torture of doing artwork to represent what happens. Now, as a result of this, he can no longer be a monk. He starts roaming the land, and he becomes a figure for people who are opposing the Inquisition or don't approve of the church. And of course, then he is hunted down by a whole heap of the people in charge, which is the Pope, which is the Church of Rome, basically. Like I said, there are English kings, but they are subservient to the Pope. Anyway, this is a fascinating story, and it ends unexpectedly, certainly not the way I expected. He's chased around, but he never really rejoins reality after that experience. And we get this small visual of how a behind-the-scenes rebellion against Catholicism might have started, with him roving the land, being this cornerstone of a rebellion by people who really don't approve of the Inquisition and don't always approve of other things about the religion. Okay, moving on. Those three first stories, The Lady Margaret, The White Boat, and Brother John, I love them. The characterization in them is immaculate. Every single one of those people, Jesse, Rafe, and John, are now people that live in my head in the same way that Han Solo lives in my head. He's a real person, completely separate from Harrison Ford. Each one of these characters, brilliant. Black magic, brilliant. The next story I had was Lords and Ladies, and this is a weird story, and it was the first hint that I got that this book is actually becoming a novel in that it self-references back to itself. It's a strange sort of story. The main character is a woman, and she is the niece of an old man. Her uncle is dying in bed, and she's there. Her name is Margaret, and her uncle is the same young man, Jesse, that we met in the first book, in the first story, The Lady Margaret. If there was a story that I didn't like in this book, it was probably that one. I loved it for the way the narrative carried you. I loved it for being inside the head. It was the first one that really didn't have any technology or any scientific element to it. And I think Roberts really shone by having a character develop through the technology of their life and era. So that was missing a bit. That story is kind of essential to take this overall narrative of Pavane to its conclusion. That one also convinced me that he doesn't do women as characters as well as men. But what you see is that transition from, I guess, working men to the upper level, the lords and ladies of the title, which is where Margaret becomes enamored of a lord who sounds like a horrible piece of work, I've got to say. His name's Robert. And she eventually marries him. That's a spoiler. Oh well. Kind of necessary for the next story, Quarf Gate, in which a descendant of Margaret, and hence of Jesse, and hence of the steam haulier business, is a phenomenal character who made me revise the fact that Keith Roberts can't do women. He did Eleanor beautifully. Eleanor is in charge of her castle. She's really young when her father dies. She's the last of her line, but she's also the inheritor of the steam train business, so she stands to have a lot of money. Hence, instead of being married off at 16 or whatever, she is confirmed as the lady of the castle by King Charles, who is her liege. She considers the king her liege and not Rome, and that creates ongoing difficulty throughout the story. This book does an amazing, this chapter, this story does an amazing job of describing how someone can be the basis of a rebellion of a nation without ever intending that. All really Eleanor wants to do is be left alone to rule her castle. But when Rome insists that it has to have grain sent in tribute, and she says, we don't produce any grain, my people will starve, she goes head to head with Rome. At that point, King Charles supports her and sends her big guns. This is seen as a symbol, but she later uses them to repel a hand of the Pope, emissary of the Pope, who is there to tell her to give her castle up to the Pope in Rome. And this triggers a huge rebellion that ends up being the rebellion that never happened in Elizabeth's time. And I'm not going to say anything more about that. But this story was the edge of your seat exciting one. This is the one where a couple of times I was reading ahead fast because I wanted to know what happened. It is a hard, bitter, long fight before Rome is banished from her gates, but even so, she doesn't get a happy ending. Even so, King Charles, in order to placate Rome, has to take certain steps. And apparently Corfe Castle is a real castle in England, which I now want to see if I ever go to England again. And the Corfe Castle as it stands today is the one that's described at the end of the battle. It's a phenomenal story. Now, the final one in this book is called The Coda. It's a very short wrap-up, I guess, of all the stories. And by a character who ties into the previous stories. I haven't also mentioned that Corfe Gate, there's also the fairy present and the signallers. So you've got the steam train story, or steam tractor? Train haulage. Steam haulage ties into Corfe Castle, but so do the signallers, because the signallers and the Guild of Signallers play a huge part in that rebellion as well, and in the fact that Eleanor gets as far as she does. The Coda, in a way, ties them all together. Now, I didn't spend a lot of time looking for it online, but I suspect the Coda was written a lot later, and purely to tie all these stories together. I have some doubts about a couple of points in it, and I'm not going to say anything else about it, because you can't really describe anything that's in it or anything that it says without not only spoilering the Coda, but spoilering the characters in it and a lot of the things that happened before. The only thing I really want to say about the Coda is, as it's describing the church and its attempts to keep technology down, throughout the book, Roberts makes these references to maybe suppressing technology and science isn't always a bad thing, or isn't always a terrible thing. I'm pretty sure that everyone being tortured to death in the Inquisition dungeons during Brother John would disagree with that point, but he keeps making these small hints that maybe there's a reason for it. Now, in the Coda, it talks about all the things that happened and all the things that didn't, and it does mention, did the church oppress? Did she hang and burn? A little, yes, but there was no Belsen, no Buchenwald, no Passchendaele. I don't even know what Passchendaele is. I should probably have Googled that first. That's the first time that we really have Keith Roberts addressing what he thinks the good of that world might be, and that's the first time that we get this world intruding on this world of Pavane, 1966 alternative universe. I've talked a lot about this. I could talk for days about this book. I haven't even started touching on the beauty of the writing, which is magnificent. I haven't touched on the fact that if you know someone who loves literature, modern literature, old literature, and they're not into science fiction, this one might get them there. But if you are not yourself into literature, if you don't read the Brontes' bleak heaths and relish every bleakness, you can still enjoy these for the story and the world building, the amazing characters. There is something here, I think, for everyone if you're in the right mood. I'm very glad I read this when I was in the right mood. I was in the mood for beautiful, spectacular writing like this. I just read a badly written book. I was in the mood for something that speculates and triggers my own imagination to speculate, and it does this as well. And I'd better stop raving about this book, because I could for a long time. If anyone else wants to rave about this book, go ahead. And if you haven't read it, and a lot of people out there don't seem to have, I think you really should read this book, because it's one of the best books I've read this year. Thank you very much for watching this rather long review, and have a great day, and read good books. Have I mentioned that I think you should read this good book? Because it's a very good book. Read good books.